It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 65...
Doing everything we can. 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 Doing everything we can.
Ah, the 80s, a time of low prices, shopping malls, video games, Dungeons and Dragons, Hairspray, arguably some of the best music to ever happen, the Satanic Panic, the crack epidemic, the Iran-Contra affair, and most importantly, Ronald Reagan. Most of the time when the 80s are brought up, people picture the better parts of the decade, like the things I just listed, and not the negatives, except for the president at the time. Reagan was integral to the 80s. Winning almost the entirety of the Electoral College both times as well as the popular vote, he was quite the popular politician. Despite winning the popular vote both times, his level of popularity wildly fluctuated while he was in office. However, weirdly, these numbers continue going up. As of February 2018, his approval rating is 72%. An approval rating this high 14 years after death is insanely high. But why? With everything that should be known about him, how is his popularity so high? When all the negatives that I just listed are public knowledge, why do people still think so highly of him? Do that many people just not know the intricacies of his administration or the darker parts of it? Well, I want to change that. I want to at least try and bring these things to light for those who might just not know or are missing context on things that might be viewed as a positive for him. With the given context, I raise the question, was Reagan really all that? A brief history of Reagan before and early on into his presidency. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born February 11, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois to parents John Edward Reagan and Nellie Clyde Wilson. According to the official White House website, while attending Eureka College, he studied economics, sociology, was on the football team, and also acted in school plays. For a short while after graduating school, he was also a sports announcer. In 1937, a screen test got him a contract in Hollywood. He then went on to appear in 53 films. During his acting career, he married twice, once to a woman named Jane Wyman and then to a woman named Nancy Davis. Both of these women were actresses. He had 2 children with each of his wives. While an actor from the years 1947 to 1952, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. Shortly after, he went on to work in the television industry during the majority of the 50s, where he spoke for General Electric. He then went back to being president of the Screen Actors Guild once more for another year from 1959 to 1960. During his time as president of the Screen Actors Guild, his political opinions shifted from more liberal to conservative when his very staunch anti-communist beliefs were put onto the forefront. After his time in the acting industry, he went on to serve as governor of California in the mid-60s to early 70s. During his time as governor, he passed a very strong gun control act called the Mulford Act, which will be touched on in a little bit. On November 4th, 1980, he won the presidential election over former President Jimmy Carter. On the very same day, just about 20 minutes after being sworn into office, hostages that were being held in Iran were released. The Iranian hostage situation was one of the key factors in Reagan getting elected over Jimmy Carter for a second term, as many Americans were disappointed by Carter's inability to get these hostages home. This is one of the greater achievements of the Reagan administration, but not without a caveat. Earlier this year, in March 2023, there was an article published to the New York Times seemingly confirming a multi-decade theory that there was foul play involved with the release of the hostages that prevented Jimmy Carter from getting another term. A man named Ben Barnes, who was at the time the youngest Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives and later became the Lieutenant Governor, came forward over 40 years later after the final moments of the Iranian hostage crisis and admitted that the purpose of a multi-country trip across the Middle East he took with a man named John B. Connally Jr. in 1980 was to change the results of the elections that very year. On this trip, the two would meet with regional leaders to deliver a blunt message to pass to Iran. Don't release the hostages before the election. Mr. Reagan will win and give you a better deal. Barnes is quoted saying, "I'll go to my grave believing that it was the purpose of the trip. It wasn't freelancing because Casey was so interested in hearing as soon as we got back to the United States." According to Barnes, Mr. Casey, a man important to the Ronald Reagan presidential campaign who would eventually become head of the CIA, wanted to know whether they were going to hold the hostages. While there is very little physical proof outside of a confirmed flight log where Barnes and Connally Jr. had actually made these series of trips and the other men involved in the scandal, quote, have long since died and Mr. Barnes has no diaries or memos to corroborate his account, end quote, there isn't any solid reason for him to be lying here either. Even if this evidence is flimsy and one is absolutely within their own right to believe that it is, this still brings to the surface that even from before Reagan's presidency was even confirmed, there was already conspiracy and controversy following the name. Only after about 2 months into his presidency, there was an assassination attempt against Reagan. A man named John Hinckley Jr., who wanted to impress actress Jodie Foster, shot at the president on March 30th, 1981. John Hinckley Jr. just recently got released from prison and is now making music on music streaming service Spotify and uploads videos onto his profile on Twitter. He has since publicly apologized for the assassination attempt. This section is much more linear compared to what will follow in this essay. Everything else after this section won't follow such a strict timeline. To start off small, let's talk about the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair is one of the biggest stains in the Reagan administration's history, and it all falls back to his rabid anti-communist sentiment that he acquired in his days as an actor in the reheating of the Cold War. During the Cold War, a multi-decade war between the capitalist powers of the world versus the Soviet Union and other proclaimed socialist/communist nations, Nicaragua went through a revolution to overthrow the Somoza family of dictators. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN for short, was a leftist revolutionary group that was being funded by the Soviet Union to accomplish their goals of government overthrow and establish a socialist government. In the 1980s, a right-wing counter-revolutionary group named the Contras was trying to take their shot at usurping the left-wing government run by the FSLN. The Reagan administration comes into play whenever they started illegally funding the Contras, which is where the Iran-Contra affair gets its name. The article Why Reagan Was Not Impeached, published by the European Journal of American Culture, written by Peter J. Ling, gives a long-form and detailed play-by-play of the affair and compares it to former President Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal and ties the Reagan administration to the presidency of Donald Trump. Most information on the section comes directly from this source, which is well worth a read for an even more detailed timeline. The scandal first came to light in November 1986 when the Lebanese newspaper Ash-Shara leaked news of American arms shipments to Iran, which directly violated the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment meant that Congress was able to limit United States involvement in Nicaragua's international conflicts. Very shortly before this, in October 1986, a plane that was smuggling weapons to the Contras was shot down. This was also in direct violation to the Boland Amendment. A man named Oliver North, lieutenant colonel, and John Poindexter, who was the national security advisor, were both fired from Reagan's staff to directly cut ties with the president to try and disconnect this affair from the very top level. Shortly after those two were fired, the House and the Senate both voted in favor of an investigation for the affair, which really set in stone the severity of the situation. Despite his large-scale popularity, as of December 1986, 47% of Americans felt that their president was lying, but at the same time, roughly the same percentage approved of his performance as president. Only a few months later, these numbers started to increase along with a growing partisanship amongst party lines. By May, as congressional hearings loomed, some polls showed that as much as 55% felt that Reagan lied when he did not know about the diversion of funds to the Contras. However, this also confirmed a growing partisanship, with 67% of Democrats compared to only 34% of Republicans viewing the Iran-Contra affair as comparable to Watergate. Like I mentioned earlier, the popularity of Reagan has grown exponentially over the years, reaching up to 72% as of 2018. Seeing how low his numbers of popularity and general populist trust almost completely shifts the perception of him always being well regarded and loved during this time period. Not only was this very low point popularity-wise, the popularity and partisanship between parties also grew exponentially. Even now, the two sides of the American political spectrum are more divided than ever. Well, yes, partisan politics have always been relevant to America, even going back to Truman. After Reagan, with the outlier being H.W. Bush, the approval of the president from the opposite party has plummeted to exponentially low numbers compared to the same party approval rating. Moving back to the affair, specifically close to the end of it, the previously mentioned investigations led to trials. Oliver North testified to the nation. According to a Washington Post article, Ollymania by Eli Rosenberg, North admitted that he had shredded key documents about the initiatives, but said he was doing what his superiors wanted and disclosed the CIA director William Casey had been aware of some of his activities. North openly admitted that he lied to unwitting Reagan administration officials, misled Congress and the public, falsified and destroyed official government documents as part of a preconceived cover-up plan designed to protect his superiors, and specifically the president. But he also implied higher-ups with his repeated assertions that all of his actions had been approved by higher authority, the Post reported. While testifying, North wore his Marine uniform to try and garner sympathy for himself, and it worked quite well. An ABC News poll cited by the Post at the time found that 92% of the public thought that North did well in defending his actions. 64% came to see him as a victim and not a villain in the scandal. North ended up being convicted for obstruction of Congress, destroying documents, and receiving an illegal gratuity, according to the Post article. North was later pardoned by George H.W. Bush in the next administration and went on to being the president of the National Rifle Association. To bring it all back to Reagan again, the end of the Washington Post article is a quote from an online post made by political scientist at Colby College named Laura Sees, saying, "When I teach the Iran-Contra affair and Oliver North to intro IR students, they stare at me in total disbelief. Like they literally don't believe a story that crazy could be true. In real life. Under Reagan." And I couldn't agree more. The Iran-Contra affair is insane, and many people who lived through it are still here. People my age who are not politically involved simply do not know about it. Most history lessons in school do not even get to the portion of history where Reagan is president, let alone talk about the intricacies of it. The first article by Peter J. Ling that I quoted compared the severity of it all to the Watergate scandal, which is one of the few acts to get a president impeached. If Nixon did not resign, he was on track to being removed from office. Whether Reagan himself was directly involved or not, the Reagan administration will always have this ugly stain right in the middle of his presidency. Out of everything to come from the Reagan administration, this is one of the biggest standouts and deserved to be included and deserved its own dedicated section. Moving right along, let's talk about drugs, prison, racism, and Reaganomics. At face value, these four subjects might seem like a lot to pack in one part. However, this is for a good reason. All four of these subjects intersect and impact each other in ways that are almost too intricate to separate them into their own section. While the majority of this essay is focused on Reagan's presidential administration, it's hard to disregard what happened during his 2 terms as governor, especially when it comes to racism, both verbally and systemically. Systemic racism is a very complex issue that has roots in American history before the country was even established. There are many different elements that go into systemic racism, most of which stems from slavery. Systemic racism is something the average white person probably doesn't understand, especially in the manner of experiencing it. However, unless using dog whistles that are not as common knowledge, verbal racism is very clear, especially if someone is calling an African person a monkey, which Reagan did on the phone to former President Richard Nixon.
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television, as I did,
Yeah.
to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog.
I'm sure if you haven't heard this audio before, this comes as quite a shock to hear a former president say something so vile about people of color. Obviously, yeah, there are worse things that U.S. presidents have done to African people. Many of the first few presidents of the U.S. owned people as slaves. Slavery was a plague upon the country that took almost 100 years to resolve, but this wasn't during slavery. This was in 1971. This is only 51 years ago. Earlier, I mentioned there was also systemic racism that created legislation that negatively impacted black Americans, specifically members of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was a radical left-wing black nationalist group that believed in black liberation from capitalism, founded by Huey P. Newton and a man named Bobby Seale in the 1960s. The Black Panthers provided community aid, such as their vastly popular free breakfast program, provided free medical care with clinics that they would set up, and patrolled predominantly black neighborhoods to try and prevent law enforcement abuse, usually by driving or walking around, making it very clear that they were carrying large assault weapons. In the late 1960s, the previously mentioned Mulford Act was passed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan and was used to stunt the strength of the Black Panther Party. In 1967, there were 30 members of the Black Panthers protested on the steps of the California State House, armed with 3.57 Magnums, 12-gauge shotguns, and 45 caliber pistols, and announced, "The time has come for black people to arm themselves." This caused fear among conservatives and led to the Mulford Act, which banned open carry of loaded assault weapons, one of the most extensive and harsh pieces of gun legislation in the history of America. From a modern-day perspective, any substantial gun legislation being passed is almost unheard of. It's one of the most heated debates between the American left and the American right. With a piece of legislation this restrictive coming from conservatives almost sounds wrong, especially taking into consideration the modern-day strong emphasis on the right to carry. At face value, this could be overlooked as a non-racial issue. Don Mulford himself claims the bill being passed
has nothing to do with any racial incident.
Well, yes, this did impact everybody and not just the Black Panther Party. It was the protests from the Black Panthers that got the ball rolling for this act to be passed in the first place. Moving away from Reagan's time as governor and back to his presidency, let's talk Reaganomics. Reaganomics, a term coined by a man named Paul Harvey, is the name for Reagan's financial and economic policy that also greatly affected social aspects of America as well. The main pillars of Reaganomics go as follows. 1. Reduce the growth of government spending. 2. Reduce the marginal tax rates on income for both labor and capital. 3. Reduce regulation. And 4. Reduce inflation by controlling the growth of the money supply. The idea behind this is that if there's more money at the top, hence the plentiful tax cuts I'll talk about in just a moment, will eventually come back down to those who do the work. The people at the top, the already rich people / corporations, will use the money to invest in better business practices which will create more jobs that will pay better, and everyone makes more money and pays less taxes on it. The government wouldn't have to help you anymore, and you would be helping yourself and your bosses, and everything would work. However, this is not what happened. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 was one of 2 tax acts that was passed under Reagan. This first one was meant to slash taxes. The biggest tax cuts were for the wealthy Americans, with the top rate cut from 70% to 50% over 3 years. The bottom bracket was cut from 14% to 11%. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 took the already low 50% for the wealthiest Americans all the way down to 28%. There was more than $22 billion in cuts to social welfare programs, including federal student loans and the Comprehensive Employment Act. While all of this is happening, Reagan was also rapidly, and I mean very rapidly, increasing military spending. In 1980, the last year that Reagan's predecessor set spending priorities, the defense budget was $143 billion. By the time Reagan's second term began, it was headed over $300 billion. When Reagan was coming into office, the national debt was $995 billion. The number almost tripled by the start to end of his presidency. With the article, The Shadow of Ronald Reagan is Costing Us Dearly, the author Claire Potter mentions that because of the fiscal policy and budget cuts, instead of helping poor Americans like it was supposed to, nearly 6 million more people fell into impoverished positions. One may assert that early stages of unemployment shouldn't reflect the overall growth in an administration, since employment did go back up throughout the administration. However, much like modern day, the social safety nets that pieces of legislation like the New Deal had secured for Americans before was gone. Even though this happened roughly 40 years ago at this point, we're still feeling the impacts of these pieces of legislation. These decisions had lasting effects that changed the way the country fundamentally worked. From 1979, only a year before Reagan was elected into the office, to 2020, wages only have grown by 17.5%, while productivity has gone up by 61.8%. The middle class continues to shrink because of the tax breaks that allowed massive business owners to grow their wealth by the billions, while average people like you and I struggle day to day. More Americans are in prison now than ever, most of which aren't even for violent offenses. Whether you lean left or right politically, these are just undeniable facts. Party lines don't dictate whether or not you're rich or poor, but policy passed by rich people like Reagan causes suffering for the average person and the poor. Just a moment ago, I mentioned prisons. I want to bring focus to that and bring the war on drugs into the picture and how this affected Black Americans. Aaron Morris, an Associated Press writer, wrote an article named 50-Year War on Drugs Imprisoned Millions of Black Americans, published by PBS, that details the effect of the war on drugs, especially regarding black people in America. While the war on drugs predates the Reagan administration, technically starting with the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration caused things to escalate immensely with things such as mandatory minimum sentencing. Mandatory minimum sentencing, as the name suggests, is when certain charges, in this case with drugs, will always have a certain amount of time that one must serve in prison. In 1986, an act called the Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was passed. This made possession of drugs much, much harsher when it came to sentencing. Certain drugs, specifically crack cocaine, were the primary focus. It just so happens that Black Americans are the ones that were predominantly affected by the crack cocaine epidemic. An Associated Press review of federal and state incarceration data shows that between 1975 and 2019, the U.S. prison population jumped from 240,593 to 1.43 million Americans. Among them, 1 in 5 were incarcerated with a drug offense listed as their most serious crime. Narrowing it down more, specifically the impact it had on Black Americans as well as Latino Americans, the racial disparities reveal the war's uneven toll. Following the passage of stiffer penalties for crack cocaine and other drugs, the Black incarceration rate in America exploded from 600 per 100,000 people in 1970 to 1,808 in 2000. In the same time span, the rate for Latino population grew from 208 per 100,000 to 615, while the white incarceration rate grew from 103 per 100,000 to 242. Yes, I am aware that the statistics shown in the article do predate and bleed past the Reagan administration, but the Reagan administration is smack dab in the middle of the data provided. On top of that, like just mentioned, mandatory minimum sentencing was introduced federally for drug charges. So it isn't a coincidence that the incarceration rates exploded during and after the Reagan administration. Earlier, I was talking about systemic racism in the Black Panther Party. The same thing applies here, but much more direct. Reagan's systemically racist attitude towards black people didn't change over the nearly 20 years that he held office. You cannot deny the impact that Reagan and his administration had on the Black American community, which many still feel the pains of to this day. Black men are still being arrested at a disproportionate rate to white men, most of which fall from the same Reagan-era policy. If you were not aware of the level of damage the Reagan administration did to Black Americans before, I hope it sticks with you now and has opened your mind further on this specific part of history. Speed round. Before I move on to the final section of this essay, I wanted to do a quick dishonorable mention section for all the other things that I feel that should be brought up when talking about Reagan and his administration. Most of these have counterpoints, and I'll be covering them as quickly as I can for the sake of time. Very early on into his presidency in mid to late 1981, air traffic controllers, or PATCO, went on strike. These were all technically federal employees, and federal employees are technically not allowed to strike. 11,345 striking air traffic controllers were fired and barred them from ever working again for the federal government. This is the anti-union activity that I mentioned earlier on. While yes, union membership was already at a decline before Reagan took office, the firing of these employees set precedent for private sector unions to strike down harder on striking employees. During Jimmy Carter's administration, there was a push for more clean and green energy. Did you know that Jimmy Carter actually installed 32 solar panels onto the White House? They're not there now because Ronald Reagan's administration took them down in 1986. During Reagan's deregulation, tax credits and research funds that were involved in Jimmy Carter's greener energy policies were also cut down. There still are no solar panels on the White House to this day. I am aware that greener and cleaner energy isn't everybody's favorite subject and has a lot of debate whether or not it's actually worth it, since it can be costly with installation, isn't always the most reliable because of weather conditions, and does take up a lot of space. These points, however, don't discount or disprove the amount of research that has gone into the positives of cleaner and greener energy that very, very much outweigh the negatives. Staying on fossil fuels and other alternatives that increase global warming is proven to be bad for the planet. Prior to his administration, there were some pushes and initiatives to try and switch America to the metric system. Reagan stopped this in 1982 by disbanding the metric board, which was established just a few years prior in 1975. Back during his governor days, Reagan shut down all 28 UC and Cal State campuses due to students protesting the Vietnam War and the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. College prices increased under his administration. Student debt also became more of a problem that nearly every single college student to this day has to deal with. A staff member of the Nixon administration named Roger A. Freeman defended him and said, "We are in danger of an educated proletariat. That's dynamite." With this section coming to an end, I want to get personal. This section is the reason I wanted to write and create this video essay in the first place. When I was younger, probably around the 5th grade, I realized that I was queer. I never really knew how to process this for a long time, so I didn't. I kept it to myself for years. I never planned on telling anybody and just didn't want to think about it. It didn't seem like it would even matter, partially out of fear of rejection by anybody. I just kept it to myself. Fast forward a couple years to 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic happened. Social change was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement hitting heights it wasn't even close to before. There was an upcoming election, and I was inside alone with my thoughts more than ever. I was around 15 to 16 years old and was starting to take interest in politics because of everything that was going on. While this was happening, I had a lot of time to think and reflect as my view of the world was rapidly changing and developing. I was thinking about my sexuality more than ever and came to terms with it. In early 2021, I came out to my partner and close friends and family. It felt like a weight that had been lifted off my chest, and I could think clearly again. I could start living life as my authentic self in ways I didn't know I could. I was more comfortable, found my mental health improved, and was just generally having a good time. Around the same time, I finally started attending a local trade school to develop my art and passion for filmmaking. Early on in my first year, we were assigned artists at random to do a project on. The artist I was assigned was a man named Keith Haring, a queer street artist who I quickly became very attached to. While researching him for the project, I stumbled into something that every queer person does at some point in their life and found out about AIDS. Keith Haring was a victim to the AIDS pandemic and died at the young age of 31. I had heard about AIDS before this, but I never really truly knew how bad it was. The more I learned, the worse it got, and there was always one person I always led back to, the 40th president, Ronald Reagan. After finishing the project, with my interest in politics ever growing, I continued to look into Ronald Reagan. The more I learned, the more I didn't understand. Every new thing I learned about him, my distaste in him grew. For the past 3 years of my life, Reagan has been such an impactful part of it all, and I can tell you that it was not positive. There is a reason I didn't mention the AIDS pandemic for the entirety of this essay, and it's to reflect on how Reagan handled himself. Reagan himself didn't even say the word AIDS until the near end of his presidency. The AIDS pandemic. According to the National Institutes of Health, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is the most advanced stage of human immunodeficiency virus infection, HIV. HIV attacks and destroys the infection-fighting CD4 lymphocyte of the immune system. The loss of CD4 cells makes it difficult for the body to fight off infections, illnesses, and certain cancers. In June of 1981, just a little under 5 full months of Reagan being in office, the first few cases of AIDS were being discovered among gay men in Los Angeles. By the end of that year, there were 337 reported cases in the U.S., 321 adults/adolescents, and 16 children under the age of 13. Of those cases, 130 are already dead by December 31st. Reagan has not mentioned the word AIDS publicly. Most of the following information that I'm about to share is directly from the short film/documentary When AIDS Was Funny, directed and produced by Scott Kalanick. October 15, 1982 is the first time the Reagan administration's Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speakes was asked about AIDS. When confronted by journalist Lester Kinsolving, Speakes joked about it, asking, "I don't have it. Do you?" When Kinsolving referred to it as the gay plague, other press members proceeded to laugh. 853 people have died from AIDS in the U.S. Reagan has not mentioned the word AIDS publicly. On June 13, 1983, there was a White House press briefing. During this meeting, Speakes claims that President Reagan was briefed on AIDS during a cabinet meeting and that he, quote, ordered the higher priority to be given to the research on the matter, end quote. It was later revealed that Speakes was lying during these briefings. At this point, 2,304 deaths occurred from AIDS. Reagan has not mentioned the word AIDS publicly. On December 11, 1984, there was another White House press briefing. When Kinsolving was approaching the stage to ask questions, Speakes and other press members laughed as Speakes said, "This is going to be an AIDS question." Speakes claimed that he hadn't heard any expressed concern about AIDS coming from Reagan. At this point, 4,251 deaths occurred from AIDS. Reagan has not mentioned the word AIDS publicly. In the mid-80s, into Reagan's second term in office, Mayor Dianne Feinstein's AIDS budget for the city of San Francisco was bigger than the entire nation. Reagan actually wanted to lower spending in 1986 to $85.5 million, an 11% decrease from 1985's $95 million. In 1985, 5,363 deaths occurred from AIDS. Reagan has not mentioned the word AIDS publicly. In 1986, a total of 16,301 deaths have occurred from AIDS. Reagan has not mentioned the words AIDS publicly. On April 2nd, 1987, Ronald Reagan mentions the word AIDS for the first time. He refers to it as public enemy number one. With the amount of time that passed between 1981, when the first cases were appearing, to 1987, 1 year before his last full year in office, 21,000 people had died from the disease. It took him 6 full years to even mention it publicly, and by then, tens of thousands have died. No, have been murdered, most of them being gay and bisexual men. All of these people, largely ignored by their government because of their sexuality. It didn't matter. It only affected the queers. It didn't matter. It was the gay plague. Despite all of this awful, awful treatment that queer people were subjected to during the 80s, things did get better. At this point in time, there are life-saving drugs that prolong HIV and help prevent AIDS from fully developing. The LGBTQ+ community continues to thrive in the face of oppression and legislation that attempts to ban my brothers, sisters, and siblings. Somehow, one might still ask, why should I care? Take a moment to put yourself in the shoes of one of the 89,343 people who died from AIDS under his presidency, getting infected with a disease that, at the time, you knew was going to lead to your death. Knowing that you're going to be so sick that you physically wither away until you get something else that will guarantee you dying. Knowing that your government has put forth so little effort that individual cities have a higher budget for your care than the entire government does. Think of what your family would have to go through, watching you turn into nothing as you lose all sense of self. You and I get to live and experience life. The 89,343 people that died during Reagan's reign had theirs cut short. Like mentioned previously, this final part of the essay is why I wanted to make this in the first place. If you take anything from this essay at all, I want it to be this last section. Everything else that is mentioned is just as important, but his mistreatment of the AIDS pandemic personally hurts a part of me in different ways than the rest. When I talk about Reagan to others, my emotions tend to lead into anger and ranting to whoever is willing to listen for as long as they can. When I talk about the AIDS pandemic, that rage instantly turns into sorrow for the countless lives that were lost. These people didn't deserve to die because of who they are, but that's what happened. And this will forever be part of American history, that one of the most loved presidents in recent history allowed this to happen. This video originally was meant to open minds and at least spark conversation about the 40th president. I was going to try my hardest to try and stay as neutral as I could and deliver points in a manner for people that view Reagan positively could try and see it with an open mind. I wanted to try and reach out to others who didn't know the depth of the Reagan administration like I did roughly 3 years ago. I wasn't coming into the mindset of this essay with the mindset of, I'm going to change minds on Reagan. I just wanted to make publicly available knowledge more accessible. But, at the end of it all, talking about the AIDS epidemic, the purpose of this essay shifted for me completely. Over the past 3 years of my life, Reagan was a part of it, whether I liked it or not. Whether it was from feeling the ripples and real-world consequences of his administration's actions, or just me getting angry at something and somehow connecting it back to him, he was always there. I made it a running joke with my family that I could tie anything that was wrong with America back to him. I let a man who died before I was even alive take up so much of my mind space and let him impact my mental health in ways that no other person ever has. The more I wrote about him for this essay, the more I researched into it, the less I felt like he had control over my mind. By the time I finished writing this section about the AIDS epidemic, my entire attitude shifted. I went from somewhat angrily typing and researching everything else that he did to feeling nothing but sadness for the lives that were lost, not only for my community, but for everyone else that was also impacted. My hatred for him comes from a love of others, for my brothers, sisters, and siblings of the world who feel the impacts from him. The passion that I have had to try and inform others about the negatives of the Reagan administration comes from a place of compassion and love for others. I do hope that those who stuck to this portion who had a more positive view of Reagan and his administration will look at this section of history through even a slightly different lens, because that was my original goal. Hopefully, by this point, you're wondering to a certain degree, was Reagan really all that? Personally, I think I'm going to move on from Reagan for a while. I'm always going to unconsciously think about the impacts that he's had, because ignoring what he has done would completely undermine everything that I just talked about through this entire video. But for now, I'm done letting him control my headspace like this. There's so much to love about each other in this world, even when times are as hard and as trying as ever. I want to try and put forth an effort into focusing more on the positives and how that could open people's minds instead. Thank you for watching and listening.